August 6, 1943. Vella Gulf, the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese destroyers heading south in complete darkness, carrying 900 soldiers and dozens of tons of supplies for the garrison on Kolombangara. The division commander, Captain Kaju Sugiura, knows the Americans will try to intercept his column. He accepts that. Because the Japanese Navy spent 20 years building a system that made night combat its personal advantage, and for the last 18 months that system had performed flawlessly, sinking or disabling 11 American cruisers at night. In these exact waters, at 11:33, 6 American destroyers picked up the Japanese column on radar. Range, 20,000 yards, 11 miles. Not a single Japanese eye had yet seen a silhouette, a wake, a flame. At 11:41, 24 torpedoes entered the water. The Japanese discovered the enemy when the first explosions tore through the hulls of their ships. 3 of the 4 Japanese destroyers burned that night. Around 1,000 men went to the bottom. American losses, 0. This was not luck, and it was not an exception. Over 18 months, from November 1942 to November 1943, the Japanese Navy lost 13 destroyers in night engagements around the Solomon Islands. The Americans lost 2. That kind of ratio doesn't happen by chance. The official version of this period reads like a series of American tactical victories in battles with unpronounceable names: Vella Gulf, Cape St. George, Vella La Vella. Names that mean nothing to anyone outside naval historians. The real version is different. One radar changed not the outcome of a single battle, but the variability of the Japanese Navy to fight at night. And the Japanese Naval General Staff, which had spent 20 years building the longest-range torpedo weapon in the world, had classified it so deeply that it couldn't understand, and couldn't admit, that the weapon had stopped working. While its men burned in the darkness, the staff kept sending more. At the end of this video, the man who designed what was killing Japanese destroyers night after night, his name today is carried by a class of American warships patrolling the world's oceans right now. He died at 94, having outlived every admiral he ever defeated and every fleet his main adversary ever built. But that comes later. First, the machine. To understand what happened at Vella Gulf, you need to look at one piece of equipment, not the guns, not the torpedoes, not the armor, the screen, the SG radar, a microwave surface search radar that Raytheon and the MIT Radiation Laboratory assembled from British magnetron technology, handed to the Americans in 1940, operating frequency 3 GHz, surface detection range up to 17 miles, accuracy within 200 yards. But the numbers weren't the point. The point was how it showed the world. Earlier radars gave you a blip on a linear scale, a mark the operator had to mentally translate into a position on the water. The SG gave you a PPI display, a plan position indicator, a round glowing screen with your own ship at the center, and around it, in real time, a map of everything the radar beam could touch. Coastlines, islands, ships, their movement. The operator looked at the screen and saw the water from above, in complete darkness, through rain, for 11 miles in every direction. For a young sailor standing at that screen for the first time, on a night watch in the Solomon Sea, the sensation was almost impossible to process. Dots on a glowing circle, range, bearing, speed, enemy ships that didn't know they were being watched. It took months of training before operators learned to trust what the instrument was showing, not to doubt it, not to glance over the rail to confirm it, in the second when they needed to act. But the screen alone solved nothing. What solved something was what they did with it on a ship called Fletcher. Fletcher, hull number 445, was the lead ship of an entire class of destroyers. Laid down in Boston in July 41, commissioned on June 4, 42, the exact same day American dive bombers were sinking Japanese carriers off Midway. On board served Commander William Cole and his executive officer, Joseph Wiley. Cole, before this assignment, had completed a course at the Naval Research Laboratory, where he had been working on shipboard radar systems. He knew what he was holding. Together, they invented what would become standard for every navy in the world: the Combat Information Center. The idea was simple and therefore revolutionary. Put an officer at the PPI screen and make his only job to continuously feed the captain a picture of the battle, where the enemy is, where he's going, at what speed, at what angle. The captain on the bridge no longer split his attention interpreting sensor data. He received a finished tactical picture and made his decision without taking his hands off the con. Fletcher itself had one other feature the crew considered at least as important as the radar: add up the digits of the hull number, 4, 4, 5, and you get 13. At the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 42, the ship was the 13th in her formation's line. The battle fell on a Friday the 13th. Fletcher came through without a single hit, and the crew, rather than fearing the number, turned it into a talisman, Lucky 13. On a fleet where superstition was as much a part of life as salt water, that said more about the spirit of a crew than any official report ever could. Men who trust their ship fight differently. Now, the ship's specifications, briefly: 2,050 tons, 376 feet, 35 knots, 336 men, 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes. By the standards of her time, solid, well-balanced, nothing especially remarkable compared to what the Japanese were building. On paper, Japanese ships were just as good, and in some respects better. Japanese destroyers operating around the Solomons through mid-43 had nothing comparable to the SG. Their night combat doctrine was built on the human eye. Hand-selected lookouts with 7-power night binoculars, long dark adaptation sessions before going on watch, years of trained skill in reading a target's range and course from its silhouette against the water. It was a good system. In 41 and 42, it outperformed American radar, not because the radar was poor, but because no one yet knew how to use it. Operators were green. Commanders didn't know how to fold radar data into a tactical decision. Too much time passed between contact and shot. The Japanese could see that, and they concluded it would always be that way. On paper, watch rotation on an American wartime destroyer looked manageable: 4 hours on, 8 hours off, 3 cycles a day. In the Solomon Sea, that schedule meant almost nothing. Burke's squadron, at the height of its activity, spent 28 days out of every 30 at sea. 8-hour rest blocks were cut short by general quarters, air raids, sudden full-speed runs on orders from headquarters, and drills the Navy stubbornly ran even when the ship hadn't cooled down from the last engagement. At peak operations, a man slept 2 to 3 hours in 24. Not straight through. In snatches, between alarms, the heat never let go. The Solomon Islands sit on the equator. In the engine rooms, with turbines running at full power, the air reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Firemen and machinists lost consciousness from heat stroke so regularly it stopped being an incident. Watch schedules below decks were drawn up with a spare man always ready to step in for whoever went down. Fresh water was rationed. The ship's distillers gave enough to drink, and almost nothing for anything else. Men washed in salt water with a special soap that barely lathered in brine and was always in short supply. Foot fungus became so endemic that the Navy issued a separate prevention circular. Men read it. It didn't help much. Boots on a deck flooded constantly by tropical rain never dried. Medicine on a destroyer meant one ship's doctor and a handful of corpsmen. Surgery happened under battle lights, on a ship that might be throwing a torpedo evasion maneuver at that exact moment, and the man on the table felt the deck slide out from under him. And over all of it, the constant proximity to a death you couldn't see coming. Destroyers sink fast. After a hit to the engine room, men had 2 or 3 minutes, and only if someone could get the right watertight door open in time. Part of the crew always worked below the waterline. Boilers, turbines, magazines. Those men knew their arithmetic by heart. If a torpedo hit below the waterline, Your chance of getting out depended entirely on how fast you could move through darkened compartments that might be flooding from 3 directions at once. But more than the heat, the exhaustion, and that quiet arithmetic of the lower decks, the crew feared one thing above all else: torpedoes they couldn't see. Not the impact itself. That was chance. It was the invisibility. The Japanese torpedo attack was built on a principle the Americans understood intellectually, but couldn't live with easily. The torpedo is already running toward you at the moment. When no searchlight, no radar, no eye has picked up anything. When the night is quiet, and by every indication, nothing is happening. The Type 93 left almost no wake on the surface, unlike American torpedoes, which trailed a visible bubble track. The first sign of an attack was the explosion. And on the night of November 30th, 1942, off Tassafaronga, everything worked exactly as designed. Only this time, the Americans had radar, and they still lost, because a radar is not a doctrine. November 30th, 42, 23:14. The destroyer flagship Fletcher, Commander William Cole, picks up a solid radar contact on the Japanese column at 7,000 yards. Cole knows what he's seeing. At 23:15, range is perfect for a torpedo spread. He radios the task force commander for permission to fire. Admiral Carlton Wright goes silent for 2 minutes, then comes back. Range to target's excessive. Cole pushes back. Range is fine. 2 more minutes pass. Permission finally comes through. 4 minutes. That's how long the Japanese column sat in perfect firing position, while the American destroyer commander waited for an admiral on a cruiser to authorize what the radar had been showing him the whole time. In those 4 minutes, Japanese lookouts, no radar, just eyes, spotted the American column. Admiral Tanaka immediately ordered the unloading stopped and attacked. The Japanese launched their torpedoes and ran. American torpedoes, fired 4 minutes late, passed behind ships that had already changed course. American cruisers opened up with their guns and lit themselves up with muzzle flashes in the dark. The Type 93s arrived 5 minutes later. Northampton. Sunk. Minneapolis. Bow, blown off by a torpedo, survived only because the crew spent the night packing the hole with everything they could pull from nearby compartments. New Orleans. The entire bow section torn away up to the second turret. Pensacola. Hit in the aft engine room, burning through the night. Of 8 Japanese destroyers, the Americans sank one. And only because it stayed back to cover the withdrawal, Nimitz wrote one word in the post-battle review. Training. He was wrong. Or rather, he was right about tactics and completely wrong about what had actually happened. The problem wasn't crew readiness. The problem was a command procedure that, at the decisive moment, required a destroyer commander, a man with a radar lock and a perfect firing solution, to wait on an admiral who was seeing the same situation through second-hand channels with a time lag. The radar had given the destroyers an information advantage over their own chain of command, and the chain of command had no idea what to do with it. And that was only one of 2 problems. The Mark 14 torpedoes loaded on the destroyers ran 2 to 3 feet deeper than set. Passing beneath the keels of Japanese ships without detonating, the defect had been noticed as early as the summer of 42. The Bureau of Ordnance denied its existence until July 43. For 18 months, destroyers fired at enemy ships with torpedoes that dove under them. Crews didn't understand why. Commanders filed reports. Reports disappeared into a bureaucracy that couldn't bring itself to admit that the Navy's best torpedo was broken by design. These were real failures, painful, paid for in lives. And, here's the thing, the American Navy acknowledged them. The command procedure was rewritten. The torpedoes were fixed. Both problems closed within 8 months of being officially entered into the record. The Japanese Naval General Staff did the opposite. The Type 93 was an engineering marvel, an oxygen-powered torpedo, running on pure oxygen instead of compressed air, which left almost no wake and gave it a range of 20 miles with a warhead of nearly half a ton of explosive, and so classified that Japanese officers weren't permitted to discuss its characteristics with colleagues in other units. Speed, range, propellant, all sealed. The data on how it performed in combat was never assembled into a single picture. Each division commander filed reports to the 8th Fleet staff, which forwarded them to Tokyo through a chain of layers, and each layer interpreted failures according to its own understanding. There is not a single piece of evidence that the Naval General Staff made any serious effort to understand why Japanese destroyers were going down one after another in the second half of 43. There is evidence of the opposite. Losses were attributed to individual command error, to growing American strength, to bad luck. Not to radar, not to the fact that the Americans had rewritten the rules of night combat. The torpedo itself had another side. Tokyo preferred not to think about. The pure oxygen that gave it range made it lethally dangerous to its own ship. A hit to a compartment carrying loaded Type 93s didn't just disable a destroyer, it turned it into a bomb. At Vella Gulf, the magazines of Kawakaze and Arashi detonated from the inside. The ships didn't sink, they came apart. The weapon the Japanese Navy had planned to win night battles with was, in a battle already lost, finishing off its own, and what the Japanese commanders in the field understood. That's a separate question. Division commanders in the Solomon Sea in 43 were watching it with their own eyes. The Americans were firing torpedoes from ranges at which they had no business being visible. Then gunfire, onto targets that were already burning. Breaking off was possible, but it aborted the supply run they'd come to complete. Counterattacking meant turning into the darkness toward an enemy with no known position. Torpedoes went out blind and missed because the Americans had already moved while you were finishing your own salvo. The men on those decks understood what was happening. But in a system where doctrine was written in Tokyo and never revised from the evidence coming out of the Solomon Sea, what the deck commanders understood stayed in the Solomon Sea. Along with their ships, 20 years of work. And the system started killing its own men, not because the enemy had a better weapon, but because it had no mechanism for admitting that its own best weapon no longer worked. If you're finding the story of how radar changed the Pacific War interesting, subscribing helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. August 6th, 43, Vella Gulf. The same battle that opened this video. But now we have everything we need to understand what was happening inside those ships in the 14 minutes between first contact and the last explosion. After Tassafaronga, the Americans finally did the actual work. Not training, a specific decision, a destroyer with a solid radar contact and positional advantage was authorized to fire torpedoes on its own without asking permission from the cruiser commander. From Tassafaronga to Vella Gulf was 8 months. Exactly as long as it took the Navy to stop getting in the way of its own destroyers, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger knew about the Type 93. After the Navy, that summer, had finally acknowledged its real specifications, the objective was clear. Hit before the Japanese realized they were being hit. The only way to do that was to track them on radar without giving yourself away, and release torpedoes before the enemy had time to turn for a counterattack. He also knew something else. Intelligence had confirmed. None of the Japanese ships tonight carried radar. And behind the Japanese column rose the mountain mass of Kolombangara. Its coastal echo on the screen masked the American approach better than any smokescreen. At 23:33, the SG caught the Japanese column at 20,000 yards, to the optimal firing range of 8,000 yards, 9 minutes away. Moosbrugger didn't call for permission. He brought his ships into position. 6 destroyers in 2 divisions maneuvered off the PPI picture. Every commander could see his own sector and the position of his neighbors. At 23:41, the 1st Division released 24 torpedoes. The 2nd simultaneously took position across the Japanese course, so that the Japanese couldn't run at speed to either side without risk of being hit. Japanese lookouts at that moment saw nothing. The night was clear, but the Americans were running without lights, at a speed where a silhouette merges with the horizon, and from 11 miles, no eye, however trained, can make out anything recognizable as a warship. In the combat information centers, they counted seconds. What came next? We have from the man who saw it from the Japanese side. the captain of Shigure. Tamechi Hara, the only one of the 4 Japanese commanders who survived that night and later described it. Hara was setting up his own torpedo spread when he caught a flash of white tracks on the water, the nearest 800 meters away. He shouted hard to starboard. At that same instant, a pillar of fire rose from the middle of Arashi, 2 more from Kawakaze. Flagship Hagakaze was farther ahead and in line with them, so Hara couldn't see her at all. Hagakaze and Arashi were hit almost simultaneously. Their crews heard the explosions before they saw anything. In a steel hull, the concussion travels faster than any visual signal. Men on the stern of Hagakaze felt the deck drop out from under them and caught a flash forward in the bow. That was everything they had time to understand. Where the torpedo had come from, how far, whether this was one ship or an entire squadron, it stayed unknown for several minutes more. Kawakaze took a torpedo in the forward magazine and went up all at once. Arashi blew apart from the inside at 12:10. That was her magazine, packed with loaded Type 93s, and that closed the account. Hara on Shigure managed to fire 8 torpedoes, toward where he calculated the Americans ought to be. All 8 missed. One clipped the rudder of a departing ship without exploding. When Hara saw Arashi's explosion and heard an American reconnaissance aircraft overhead, he concluded his sister ships were being bombed from the air and decided withdrawal was honorable. Shigure slipped into the darkness. In his memoirs, he would write that his knees nearly gave out when the 3rd torpedo was heading straight for his bow. In the report Moosbrugger sent Halsey the next morning was a sentence Burke would later quote as the most accurate description of what had happened. The enemy took no active measures against us during the engagement because he apparently did not know we were present until the first hits. The Japanese destroyers didn't fight back. There was nothing to fight back with. They didn't know they were already being seen and already being hit. Burke's turn came 3 months later, November 25th. 43. Cape St. George, the night before Thanksgiving. 5 Japanese destroyers coming back from Buka after landing reinforcements. 5 ships of his squadron waiting in the dark, with intelligence on the route and the timing. Contact at 20,000 yards. Close. Fire without warning. 3 Japanese ships on the bottom. 1 damaged. 647 dead. His own losses, 0. The only Japanese ship to come through intact was Amagiri, a name worth remembering. 4 months earlier, in August 43, in these same waters, Amagiri had rammed and sliced in half an American torpedo boat in the dark. The boat was PT-109. Its commander was John Kennedy, the future President of the United States. The one destroyer that escaped Burke was the same one that had nearly killed Kennedy. When it was over and the squadron turned for home without a scratch, Burke sent exactly 1 message to base, not a victory report. He asked them to arrange a Thanksgiving service for when they got back, the nickname 31 Knot. Burke had attached itself to him a little earlier. Headquarters had queried his position. While his destroyers were pushing into the combat zone, Burke replied in 2 words. Proceeding 31 knots, the answer was precise, complete, and quietly. Implied everything about what had been slowing him down. By November 43, Japanese night combat doctrine was dead, as a reality, even if it still lived on paper. Japanese commanders were still sailing into the Solomon Sea, still taking losses, still filing reports upward about Americans firing from ranges where they had no business being present. The numbers from this period deserve to be read slowly. 6 major night engagements. Vella Gulf, both Vella Lavellas, Horaniu, Kolombangara, Cape St. George. Japan lost 13 destroyers sunk. America lost 2. 1 to a collision with a ship on its own side, 1 to a torpedo, 6.5 to 1, with forces roughly even in each individual fight. Behind the numbers is something numbers don't carry. A Japanese sailor going into a night engagement in the fall of 43 increasingly went knowing the enemy would see him first. This wasn't panic. It was a clear-eyed assessment passed from crew to crew by men who had survived earlier battles. They were sailing into the dark, knowing the dark was no longer theirs. The Type 93 remained, on paper, the primary weapon of night warfare. Over the entire Solomons campaign, it struck American ships 36 times, sinking or putting into long repair 18 vessels, a serious score, but 94% of those hits came in the first 8 months, before the Americans had sorted out their radar doctrine and handed the night torpedo shot to destroyer commanders on their own authority. After that change, the torpedo, no less powerful than it had always been, almost stopped connecting. It hadn't grown weaker. It had become useless, because everything it could do depended on one condition: approaching unseen, and approaching unseen was no longer possible. This story has one ship that ran through all of it. Shigure, the one that slipped away from Moosbrugger in the dark that night at Vella Gulf. She survived what came after as well. Vella La Vella, Surigao Strait, nearly everywhere. Japanese destroyers were going down in groups. Her crew called her unsinkable. She more or less survived the war. Then, in January 45, the American submarine Blackfin caught and sank her in the Gulf of Siam, thousands of miles from the islands where her crew had watched Hagakaze and Kawakaze burn. One of the most resilient destroyers in the Japanese Navy found its end not in battle, but in a periscope's crosshairs, in foreign waters. Now, the production numbers. These tend to get left out when people talk about this period, which is a mistake, because this is where the outcome was hidden. In 42, American shipyards launched 44 Fletcher-class destroyers. In 43, another 78. In 44, another 45, 275 ships in 3 years, more than the entire Japanese destroyer fleet at the start of the war. Every one of them carried the SG radar as standard equipment, and every new crew was trained on combat experience. The Navy collected, analyzed, and built back into its training programs. After every engagement, Japan built around 40 new destroyers in the same years, against losses it couldn't replace. By the end of 43, it had lost a third of its destroyer force. Not enough ships, not enough of the accumulated institutional knowledge the Americans were passing to each new crew. 19 Fletchers were lost for the entire war, less than 7% of what was built. By August 45, Japan had almost no destroyers left capable of putting to sea. Arleigh Burke was born on October 19, 1901, in Boulder, Colorado. Farmer's son, Naval Academy, class of 23, 18 years of battleships and destroyers, a master's in chemical engineering from Michigan Shore Billets. In December 41, he was sitting at the Navy's gun factory in Washington and considered it the end of his career. By November 43, his squadron had run 22 engagements in 4 months, 1 Japanese cruiser, 9 destroyers, a submarine, around 30 aircraft, not one ship of Desron 23 sunk. After the war, Burke went back to the fleet. In 55, President Eisenhower made him Chief of Naval Operations, skipping over 92 admirals who were senior to him in the queue. Eisenhower wanted a man who understood that technological advantage is not something you possess. It's a problem you solve again. Every day, Burke held the post for 6 years, longer than anyone in the history of the American Navy. In that time, he took the fleet into the nuclear age, jet aircraft on carrier decks, guided missiles replacing gun mounts, nuclear submarines armed with Polaris ballistic missiles. The man who had learned to kill Japanese destroyers in the dark through radar imagery and the authority of a commander to decide for himself, rebuilt the entire American fleet around the next technological revolution. And only then stood down. Arleigh Burke died on January 1, 1996, in Bethesda, Maryland. 94 years old, President Clinton stood at his funeral in the Naval Academy Chapel. In 1978, the American Navy laid down a next-generation destroyer. They named her Arleigh Burke. Today, the Arleigh Burke class, DDG-51 and its descendants, is the backbone of the United States surface fleet. Nearly 100 ships in commission and under construction. Everyone carries radar, a combat information center, and the authority of a commanding officer to act on his own judgment. The same doctrine Burke assembled piece by piece in the dark. Off the Solomon Islands in the fall of '43, Japan's Navy spent 20 years building the perfect night weapon and lost it in 18 months because they had classified it so deeply they couldn't admit when it stopped working. The American Navy acknowledged its failures, fixed them one by one, and produced a commander who understood all of it before his own admirals did. His name is on the hull of a ship standing watch somewhere at sea tonight. If this video was worth your time, a like helps other people find it, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one.